would like to encourage everybody to participate on the WHOVA chat. So if you have your phone or your laptop devices, you can ask questions in the WHOVA chat. Also, those of you who are virtual, we encourage you to ask questions through the WHOVA chat and comments and concerns. We also will have capabilities for you who are in person to ask questions live. If you want to ask a live question, the microphone will pick your voice up. So when we have that time for Q&A, we will get to that. And so we want to encourage that. And we are recording this session. All of that's going to be on the WHOVA app. And then we just encourage everybody who's virtual, if you could keep yourself on mute until we're prompted to do that Q&A portion, we would greatly appreciate it. And I think that's all the housekeeping items I have. So I'm going to hand it off to you, Amanda, to start your presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, Kirsten. Really appreciate all the work that everyone has done to put this summit together and to make the virtual and hybrid portions function smoothly. It's a pleasure to be joining you today from Philadelphia. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but thanks to all of you who've made the time for this conversation. One quick note, I have already put the slides for today's presentation attached to this workshop in the app. So if you're the kind of person that likes to go back later and look at the slides or share them with colleagues, they are already there and you can already do that. It also has my contact information. I'm going to go over quite a bit of information in our conversation today. About 6 or 8 of these slides are similar to the ones that I presented earlier today in my earlier session with Michael Matos, but the other 40 or so slides are completely different. So if you see a couple familiar ones at the front end, don't worry, we'll soon get to the brand new stuff. Next slide. So what is the Digital Equity Act? We're going to walk through sort of what is this about new funding, how this all connects to the reality that we've all been living over the past couple of years. Then I'm going to go into some nuts and bolts. How much money is coming from the Digital Equity Act? What kind of organizations will be eligible for this money? What kind of things can you spend this money on? When is it coming? Then I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about things that you as WIOA system partners can do to prepare for this opportunity. And then I'll have plenty of time for questions. Next slide. So just a little bit about my organization, National Skills Coalition. We are a DC-based nonprofit. We have 20,000 members across the country who are workforce boards, community colleges, community based nonprofit organizations, labor unions, labor management training partnerships, employers, chambers of commerce, really anyone with an interest in workforce training. Next slide. We work on both state and federal policy. I know there are many National Skills Coalition members in the audience today. We appreciate you as the powerful members of our network that can actually get policies passed. And we are appreciative of all the ways that you have advocated for workforce development, both within our organization, but also in your work more broadly. Next slide. We do our work through 3 networks, our national network doing federal policy advocacy, our state network, and of course our good friends in Illinois leading that work at the state level, and then through our Business Leaders United affiliate, which brings together small and mid-sized business owners. Okay. Let's get into the meat of the session. Almost $3 billion is coming to American communities over the next 5 years. Illinois will automatically be getting a chunk of this money because it's formula funding. So in the same way that some of the WIOA money is just formula funding, you will absolutely, as a state, be getting a chunk of this money. There will also be federal competitive grants. And in about 10 minutes, I'm going to be walking you through all the nuances of which pots of money are coming and when they're coming and who's going to qualify. But that's kind of the big picture message. Next slide. So what's the context for this? We're going to kind of pull back the camera lens for just a moment and sort of think about the last couple of years. We really saw loud and clear during the pandemic that digital skills are a necessity for everyone. Next slide. That's true whether you're a workforce professional yourself, whether you're running a workforce program, whether you're a job seeker, an incumbent worker, a dislocated worker, a displaced homemaker, any of the terms that we in the WIOA system are used to hearing. Next slide. We also know that those digital skills have sped up, right? So before the pandemic, we were seeing examples here and there. Kentucky Fried Chicken was using virtual reality goggles to train people in food safety, right? So you had to get through a virtual escape room, and Colonel Sanders would not let you leave that room unless you could prove that you knew the 5 steps to frying chicken safely. And that was kind of a curiosity, right? Then the pandemic hit, and businesses really accelerated the kind of technological change they were planning to do. So if you were a small food service company and you've been thinking about having your customers be able to order online, suddenly that became something you had to do in order to survive. If you were a logistics company or a manufacturing company, and you couldn't have people physically working as close to each other as they had been pre-pandemic because of social distancing rules, you suddenly had to get really creative in your use of technology. So we saw for businesses in agriculture and construction and manufacturing and retail and hospitality that there was this enormous increase in how frontline workers, the very people who often come through our WIOA system, were being expected to be comfortable in using technology, smartphone apps, tablet computers, point of sale devices, you name it. Next slide. And we saw this happen certainly in the retail sector, right? This is a picture actually of a Walmart worker. Walmart has a half a dozen different mobile apps that workers are expected to be conversant with. They are expected to know how to use the price change app and the inventory control app. But that's true even for smaller retailers, right? Not all of them, but even mom and pop coffee shops are now increasingly using point of sale devices and other kinds of in-store tech that workers have to be comfortable using in order to help customers use. Next slide. We also see that there's quite a difference in what industry-specific digital skills look like, right? So again, those of us in the workforce system, we're looking across industries because the employers we work with are across industries. We might be placing one person into a job who's a CNC operator in a manufacturing facility that's making recreational vehicles. We might be placing another person in a job who's a hotel housekeeper. We might be placing somebody else who is a construction worker. All of those folks need to use technology in ways that just 2 years ago they didn't need to. Next slide. We see, and we know from research, that while large employers can create these in-house digital skill building programs, small and mid-sized businesses rely on the workforce system, rely on the community college system.
Amanda, are you there?
The pressure. We've got to start looking for a new treasurer. Would you?
Amanda, are you there? We've lost audio in the in-person session.
Yeah, Kirsten, she's frozen across the board.
Okay. So
she is hopped out. My guess is she will hop right back in.
Okay.
So we will wait with bated breath.
A moment to all check our social media, right?
Hi, folks. Hopefully I'm back now.
We can hear you.
Okay. I re-entered via Zoom instead of the Whova app since the Whova app keeps freezing on me. I appreciate everybody's patience with this. Okay. So small and mid-sized businesses, right? We know that large companies can have their own digital upskilling. If you're L'Oreal Cosmetics and you're doing a global digital transformation of your company, which they are, you can do a training program for 1,200 employees, which they're doing, to help them build digital skills. But if you're a small employer with 15 employees, you might not even have a dedicated HR person. You certainly don't have a chief learning officer. You certainly don't have the capacity to do an in-house program. And that's why the workforce system becomes so, so important. Next slide. Okay. We are certainly seeing these firsthand in the workforce system. I know some of you probably, when things went virtual overnight back in March of 2020, you had to scramble to make sure your workers and colleagues had laptops at home or had proper broadband connections or had the digital skills themselves to shift to providing virtual services. So let's go to the next slide and we'll sort of talk about some of the issues that I hear over and over again from workforce leaders across the country, right? The same challenges that show up for our job seekers often show up in our own workforce centers, our own American job centers or training programs. Sometimes there's a lack of broadband access. Sometimes digital devices aren't up to date. Sometimes people don't have foundational digital skills, right? The basics like being able to comfortably send an email or download a mobile app and install it on your phone. Sometimes people have fragmented knowledge, right? Oh, I can text a photo to my grandkids. I can join a Zoom meeting, but maybe I don't feel comfortable figuring out how to set up a breakout room in Zoom, right? And sometimes people have trouble figuring out what are the in-demand industry-specific digital skills. If I am helping a construction worker find a job, what do they need to know digitally? How is that different from what they might have needed to know? If I'm helping an EMT find a job, you know, what does that look like and how is it different? Next slide. So I'd like to ask folks to just briefly share in the WIOA chat any reflections that you have about how these issues have shown up in your program or your organization, and whether you've been surprised by any of the challenges facing your colleagues or clients. And I'll just give folks a minute to do that before we move on. I know this can, when it's one presenter, it can be a lot of one person talking. So I want to make sure that we have time for folks to share reflections and learnings. While folks are doing that, and again, please do use the WIOA chat so that folks can see that. We're going to move on, and I'm going to share a little bit of data. These are the last few slides that are a repeat from what you saw earlier this afternoon if you attended my other session, and then we'll move into the brand new material. So next slide. So there is hard data that backs up all the stories I've just been telling you. The stories that I told you came from about 45 different qualitative interviews that I've done with workforce leaders and business owners over the past 2 years. But there's also some quantitative data. Next slide. This comes from a really rigorous international assessment that's called the PIAC. It was conducted before the COVID pandemic, and the data that you're going to see focuses on workers who were employed at the time the survey was taken. Next slide. Okay, we know right off the bat that foundational digital skill needs are really widespread. 31% of US workers have few or limited digital skills, few or no digital skills. You can see the green bar on the chart here. 13% is workers with no skills, 18% is workers with limited skills. We'll get back to this in a minute when we talk about this idea of fragmented knowledge. Next slide. So a lot of folks think this is an age issue. Oh, when older workers retire, we're going to move out of having this as a problem. And so it's really just going to be a short-term problem. First of all, that's not fair to older workers. A lot of them are pretty tech savvy. But second of all, unfortunately, it's overestimating the skills of younger workers. So on the slide that we're looking at here, on the left-hand side, we see folks with no digital skills. On the right-hand side, we see folks with limited digital skills. The green bars show people under the ages of 35. So you can see that between, it totals to about 25% on the no digital skills and 29% of those with limited digital skills are under the age of 35. So this is not a problem that's going to disappear in the next couple of years when a few more people retire. I see now that folks have added some reflections in the chat. I want to thank Tara for flagging that when everything went digital, it revealed the level of digital skills of staff right? That adult ed teachers or others might have had really differing skill levels. Maybe some folks are really comfortable, other folks were really not comfortable. Jamil is chiming in and saying that he also witnessed that. And then Hayden is saying that we saw that many of our students, even younger ones, had much lower digital literacy skills than we anticipated, right? So yes, Hayden is reflecting the exact thing that we're seeing on this slide here. Next slide. Okay, so what else can we say about the demographics of people with digital skill gaps? A plurality of workers with digital skill gaps are white. Again, left-hand side, no digital skills, right-hand side, limited. But they are also disproportionately likely to be people of color, right? And the reason for that is not because individual workers have failed or aren't doing things right. The reasons for that are structural. If you live in a neighborhood where broadband is not available because of redlining that's been done by, and I'm using that term informally, not in the legal sense, by ISPs and internet service providers. If you attended a K-12 school district that was under-resourced and didn't have the ability to let you participate in a computer lab every day, or couldn't send you home with a laptop when you were in high school, right? If you have low earnings because of equity gaps in salary, or if your family is subject to the racial wealth gap, you might not have been able to afford a home desktop or laptop computer. So those structural challenges underlie these racial differences in skill gaps, right? Next slide. We also see that a lot of workers with digital skill gaps also have literacy or numeracy challenges, right? So your reading or your math skills are not great, and that makes it harder to build your digital skills. Your digital skills are not great, and that makes it harder to build your reading and math skills, right? So on this chart, the blue bars are showing people with a level below high school. The green bars are showing people who have a high school level credential. And you can see that the overwhelming majority of folks with no digital skills on the left-hand side or limited digital skills on the right-hand side have one of those two levels of credential. And fewer, but not none, have a post-secondary certificate, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or a graduate or professional degree. So it is still a problem as you go higher up the educational spectrum, but it's especially a problem at the lower levels. Next slide. And of course, those are often folks coming through the WIOA system. We also know that a lot of workers with limited or no digital skills have low earnings. They could be trapped in a job because they don't have the digital skills to get a better job. They could also be trapped because their low earnings mean they can't afford to participate in training opportunities that would help them build skills. They may be relying on a smartphone that they share with multiple other family members. They might be relying on a prepaid phone with a very low cap on the data plan, right? So there's a lot of variables that can drive this. Next slide. So we talked earlier in my earlier session about this slide, which I think is the most important. Many workers who lack digital literacy nevertheless have jobs that require substantive computer skills. We know from our qualitative research, people are spending an exhausting amount of time covering for and compensating for their skill gaps. Quick story to illustrate. I did one interview with a high-end clothing retailer. This company has an intranet. So there's an iPad in the store that workers are expected to look at to get instructions from the home corporate office about things like visual merchandising. In other words, how do you set up the clothing displays? But one supervisor's team was not doing the clothing displays properly, and they kept getting in trouble with the other supervisor and her team. And then it developed that the supervisor of this 6-person team was herself not comfortable with technology. She never used the in-store iPad, and she was not instructing her workers to go on the company's intranet using the iPad so that they could get the visual merchandising instructions. So she was kind of the bottleneck that was preventing this task from being done effectively, right? So we call that an invisible drag on productivity. when one worker lacks skills that is then holding up productivity for the entire workplace, right? And so we see here on the left-hand side, among workers with no digital skills, a full 38%, so more than 1 in 3 workers, need to use moderate or complex level computer skills in their current job. And among workers with limited skills, it's even higher, it's 43%. Next slide. We talked about this before, I'm just emphasizing it again, right? Digital skills aren't binary, right? It's not like you either have them all or you don't have any. So one of the key things that we as the workforce system need to do is think about how do we avoid making assumptions about who doesn't have digital skills, and how do we help people build from the skills they have to the skills they need. So I showed you slides earlier about how workers of color are overrepresented among people with limited digital skills. I could also have shown you a different slide. It would have shown how Black users in particular over-index on technology tools. So for example, that means that if Black adults are, or Black people are 13% of the US population, they are a higher percentage of Twitter users. They are a higher percentage of other social media tool users, right? And so we see innovation happening. People are using TikTok videos for organizing work or for other kinds of labor advocacy. But that innovation is happening in a way that's often not captured well by our existing assessments and tests, right? You might not score really well on the TABE test, but you might be really good at making a short, engaging video that gets your friends to sign on to a petition for something. So one of the things for us to think about as workforce professionals is how do we design training programs that can help people build bridges between the skills they do have and the additional skills they need. Next slide. So I like to say that federal policy lags behind reality in many cases, but in November, federal policy caught up to reality and ended up passing as part of the big infrastructure bill, the Digital Equity Act. Next slide. I see we have some other people who are sort of TABE traumatized here. I love it. Thank you for that comment in the chat, Tara. So here's the timeline for that $2.75 billion in Digital Equity Act funding. Next month, we expect that the US Commerce Department will release what the feds call a notice of funding opportunity, what many of us in the nonprofit field know as an RFP or a request for proposals. You'll hear me call it a NOFO. Excuse me, and that's for the first very small pot of money. Each state will get roughly $1 million to support a year-long digital equity planning process. Your state, Illinois, will begin that digital equity planning process probably in late summer of 2022. You'll have about a year for that. Some states have passed legislation to speed up that timeline. I don't know that Illinois has done that, so my guess is you probably will be on that 1-year timeline. Then next summer, summer 2023, the feds will release the NOFO for the formula funding. So remember how I said Illinois was basically automatically going to get this money. You have to do a digital equity plan in order to qualify for it, but we expect that every state will do a digital equity plan. You'll get that formula funding. It will go to an administering agency that your governor has selected, and then that agency will oversee how it's distributed at the local level. We'll talk more about that in a minute. We'll also see a NOFO from the feds for competitive grants. And that's something where you don't have to go through your state government. You can apply directly. And I'll talk more about that in a minute too. Next slide. So what is the next step, right? We just talked about this. The digital equity planning grants is coming up in just a few weeks. Your governor will have to name the agency that will be the administering entity and will oversee this planning process. Some states are selecting their state broadband office. Some states are selecting a different entity. Whoever they pick, you want to make sure you're at the table as workforce leaders. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Next slide. So now we have another chat question that I wanted to open up for folks. Next slide. And that is, I'm curious whether any of you have already spoken to your state leaders about the digital equity planning process, and if so, what you heard. It's entirely possible that none of you have, because this is the first you're hearing about the Digital Equity Act. But I'm curious to know whether perhaps some of you were already doing research on this. So while we give folks a minute to do that, we're going to go ahead and move to the next slide. So there's a list of requirements in the law about what has to be in your state digital equity plan. And it includes identification of barriers to digital equity that are faced by covered populations. And if you look at this list of covered populations, you're probably looking at it going, oh yeah, a lot of these are folks we are seeing in the WIOA system, right? People living in low-income households, which is defined as 150% of poverty or lower, older adults, veterans, people who are racial or ethnic minorities, which is sort of old-fashioned language, but that's the language that the law uses. People with disabilities, people who are English language learners, people who have literacy needs, people who are currently incarcerated, right? And then your state is required to collaborate with key stakeholders. So there's a lot of levers here for us as workforce advocates to kind of elbow our way to the table and make sure that we as adult educators, as workforce development folks, are part of deciding what your state plan looks like. One of the reasons your state plan matters so much is this will be the roadmap for how that big money gets spent. So the small money is going to cover, that little $1 million over the next year or so is going to cover your state's digital equity planning process. The big money is going to come down in a year or so, and it will cover the kinds of activities and the kinds of populations and services that are defined in your state plan. So that's why it's so important for workforce and education to be at the table in shaping this plan. So it is terrific. It looks like Kathy Tracy, who is your state director of adult education, is already working on putting together digital equity plan recommendations. Thank you, Amber, for mentioning that in the chat. And it looks like those recommendations will be submitted to the advisory committee by the end of May. So that's pretty exciting, right? Illinois is really at the cutting edge of thinking about making sure that the adult ed perspective is part of this conversation. Next slide. So you have lots of opportunities to weigh in both formally and informally. Even if you don't get involved at the state level, states like North Carolina are doing something pretty cool. They've been doing local digital equity plans as a way of wanting to feed those local plans upwards to help inform the state conversation. So there's a university program in North Carolina that was giving little $5,000 planning grants. We wrote a blog post about it. If that's something that's interesting to you, you can check out the National Skills Coalition website and just click on Skills blog, and you'll see the post we wrote about state innovations in digital equity. But having your own vision of what would good look like for workforce center staff, for adult educators, for the adult learners and job seekers that we serve, and then helping to advocate that your state moves towards that is really important. You don't want to just be reacting to what is already being put in front of you, right? The big telecommunications companies and others are all very focused on, oh, people need to sign up for low-cost broadband. Oh, people need to get up-to-date digital devices. That's really important. Don't get me wrong. It is not digital skills, right? If we learn nothing else in the beginning of the pandemic, we learned that throwing a Chromebook and a Wi-Fi hotspot at people does not magically make them comfortable and good at using technology. So I really hope you take to heart this opportunity to develop your own vision of what good looks like. Next slide. So one additional question I have for you all. What do you think is exciting about the digital equity planning process, and/or what concerns you about digital equity planning? Please go ahead and use the WHOVA chat to make any comments or observations you'd like to make. Okay, And while you're doing that, we're going to go ahead and move to the next slide.
Amanda?
Yeah.
Would it be possible for, are we going to have time for Q&A at the end?
We absolutely will. Yeah, we have about 3 or 4 more slides here. Oh, no, sorry. We have a little more than that. But yes, okay. There will be a good 15, 20 minutes. Okay. Oh, that's a good question. Actually, are we ending at 4:30 or are we ending at 4:45?
We're going to end at 4:45. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then we have a good 20 minutes for questions.
Perfect. Yep. The live audience has some questions, so just make note of that.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. So what comes after digital equity planning, right? This is the big money. You'll get this formula funding. We don't know yet how your state is going to manage this process. Will your state put out an RFP? What exactly will that process look like? We just don't know. We don't know how any state is going to manage it. Like Illinois is not unusual, right? But that will be emerging over the next year or so. Next slide. And as we talked about, the state digital equity plan will really create a roadmap for that funding. Next slide. So there's also this third type of funding, which is federal competitive grants. There's a long list of organizations that are eligible to apply directly to the federal government, that is not going through your state, in order to get this money. You can be a local educational agency. You can be an entity that carries out a workforce development program. You can be a nonprofit. You can be a community college. That's a community college fits under the definition of community anchor institution. You can be a political subdivision, right? So for example, you could be a county within a state, right? So there are a lot of opportunities to apply directly to the feds for funding. However, putting together a federal grant application is a lot of work. And so you have a year. This is a great time to start joining together with your partners on the ground and figuring out whether you might want to collaborate on a federal funding application, right? This is a 5-year pot of money, this Digital Equity Act, so it will be sustained at least over the short term. There's also an effort underway nationally to convince the federal government to set aside a chunk of money that comes from the wireless spectrum auctions that the government runs every periodically to auction off sections of the wireless spectrum, and have that be an ongoing pot of money for digital equity work. We don't know yet if that will happen, but we do know that this funding will be around for the next 5 years. So it is a real chunk of money there. Before we go on, I want to just take a moment. I see there's some good comments happening in the chat. Make sure that I address anything that's coming through. So we talked about whether this might be a short-term focus. I saw Cynthia's comment. Love this comment from Kitty. Most exciting thing about digital equity planning is affording the opportunity to bring communities up on skills. And the concern is how to engage people who are hesitant or nervous about technology and what the security of technology would look like. Yeah. We see a comment from Hayden, worried about a lack of statewide technology integration to address the needs of clients and programs in rural areas that lack reliable internet connectivity. Yeah, we certainly see in the federal law that they're very aware that rural communities have different problems than urban communities. Not better problems, not worse problems, but definitely different problems. And the federal government has been really keenly aware that they need to put out technical assistance materials and other things to really help states think through the rural piece. I'm not here to say that they've solved all the problems, but they're certainly keenly aware that that is a really, really important issue. And I see there's some other comments on integration. Okay, next slide. So I've talked about the big chunks of money that are available. What are some things that you can do now when you go home from this conference? Next slide. So one thing you can do is kind of familiarize yourself with 3 key terms in the Digital Equity Act. The first is who's eligible to get the money. And we saw that on a slide a couple minutes ago. So you can go back and look at that and figure out where your organization fits on that list. The second is covered populations, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So next slide. So who are covered populations? Next slide. Covered populations are exactly this list, right? You saw a version of this earlier. This is just the more detailed version that comes directly from the legislative language, right? These overlap with the job seekers, workers, and adult learners that we see. There is no one more reflective of who Congress was imagining when this legislation was drafted than the people that we serve. Next slide. So a big question that we get over and over again is, okay, that's who we can serve. What can we do with this money? So next slide. The law is pretty clear that there's a whole laundry list of things that can happen, but two of the things that it's most important to know about that are defined in the law is what digital inclusion includes and what digital literacy means. So you can see that digital inclusion includes access to digital literacy training, and then you can see how the term digital literacy is defined below that. And I say this to say, the law gives us a nice big umbrella that we can fit lots and lots and lots of types of opportunities and programs and services underneath. So I urge you to try to make sure that your state thinks as expansively and as big picture as Congress was thinking when this legislation was drafted. Next slide. Okay, so if you get one of the federal competitive grants, so this is not about the money that you would get via your state agency, but this is about applying directly to the feds. If you apply directly to the feds, you have to do one of the following activities. So a long list here. I'm not going to go over all of them. If you want to read it, the legislation is actually pretty short and sweet, and this comes directly from the legislation. But one of the things you can use that money for is to implement training programs for covered populations. Remember who that list of covered populations was, that can cover basic, advanced, and applied skills or other workforce development programs. This language is in here because the lead sponsor on this legislation was Senator Patty Murray of Washington State, who knows workforce like the back of her hand, and Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, who is also very well-versed in workforce development issues. That's why this language is here in the law. And it gives us so much opportunity to do good things with this money. So I have just blitzed you through so much information, and it is the end of the day, and you are probably just really ready to go have some food, have something to drink, catch up with real humans, all that good stuff. I have just a couple more slides and then we'll stop for questions. So go ahead, next slide. This is my, it kind of feels like you're on a bucking bronco, right? There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot going on in the world. We're all still living through a pandemic. Many of us are still living in communities affected by an opioid epidemic, a gun violence epidemic. There's a lot going on in the world. So I hope that you don't leave this session today and think, my goodness, Amanda must think that I have endless hours in the day to explore new funding streams and dream up new programs. Doesn't she understand that I'm just trying to keep it all together and serve the job seekers and the clients that are in front of me right this moment? I totally get that. I spent 9 years in a direct service organization. Everything was an emergency all the time, right? My goal is to give you some very small, actionable, bite-sized options that you can do when you go home. Next slide. Talk to your business services people. What are they hearing from local employers about the digital skills that workers in your community need to have? Next slide. Make sure you're looking at your own program data, right? If you have a bunch of people from one zip code who are signing up for all your online services, and yet you're not seeing representation from other zip codes, could you do a little research to figure out what's going on there and why folks might not be able to reach it, right? We've heard so many stories of people having to go sit in a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot so they could get Wi-Fi, or having to borrow a friend's car so that they could try to work from a quiet place rather than try to do homework or an online class in a small living space with lots of other people and noise, right? So understanding what's going on in your job seekers' real lives can help you understand when and how they're accessing online and virtual services. Next slide. Make sure that what you learn, whether it's just stories from things have been like over the last 2 years or more formal research, gets shared in your state's digital equity planning process. Make sure your voice is heard there. Next slide. Think about whether your services, your contracted training services, your eligible training provider list folks, your individual training accounts, are they helping people build both foundational digital skills and industry-specific skills? And if not, are there more things you can do in contracting with training providers or connecting your job seekers to places where they can build both types of skills? Because they're both important. Very last recommendation here. If you're in a decision-making role, think about issuing guidance, next slide, to help your local workforce leaders know what they can do to support digital inclusion, even with their existing funding streams and their existing programs. So those are 5 quick things. I hope you pick one of them that resonates with you. Last slide here. This is just a reminder that people deserve our investment in their digital skills. So we've got lots of time for questions here. We've got 20 minutes. There are a couple of additional resources slides at the end of this PowerPoint. I'm not going to walk through them right now, but I urge you to download the slides from the app because there's a bunch of fact sheets and publications. And I warmly encourage you to steal our materials. We love it when people take our charts and graphs, just put a little note in the corner that says Source National Skills Coalition, and go forth, use them in your grant proposals, use them in your public presentations, use them in your staff trainings. Please, that's what they're there for. We want them to be used. So Kirsten, let me go back to you for any questions in the room live, and then I'll take a look in the WHOVA app for any questions submitted there.
Okay. Kathy, can you hear Kathy?
So I have a quick question. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear Kathy faintly. Perhaps, Kirsten, if you could rephrase her question after she asks it.
I'm just curious as to what how are you seeing other workforce systems work towards this digital equity? What are you seeing? What is happening? And how is it following the workforce systems in other schools?
Did you hear that?
No, I'm sorry. Can you paraphrase?
She said, what are other states doing for digital equity in the workforce system?
Yeah. So
what have you seen them? What have you seen other states doing? Like examples?
Yeah. So the St. Paul Workforce Board started early using CARES Act funding and then using American Rescue Plan Act funding with a partnership between the Workforce Board and a local adult education organization, so a WIOA Title II provider. And they created 500 tech packs. So this was a digital device, a connection to wireless internet, and some digital navigation and digital skills help that were available to families in the St. Paul area. And many of the families that received these tech packs were low-income families, families with limited education, families with limited English skills. So that was a very foundational skills focused initiative. But you know, they were quick out of the pack to say, okay, we as a workforce board recognize that folks may not have the tools they need to even participate in online learning or other opportunities. So that's the first example. The second example is in Hawaii. The Hawaii Department of Labor and Industry partnered with the state economic development folks, the state library, and adult education folks to do a really interesting and comprehensive digital readiness survey. They issued a whole 155-page report, which is linked on the National Skills Coalition website. You don't have to read the whole report. You can scroll until you get to their nice, pretty charts and graphs, and that'll tell you a powerful story. They did this survey to really get a baseline. What are the digital skills of folks in Hawaii? How do they differ in rural communities? How do they differ in by age or by demographic status? And how can that inform what we as the workforce system need to do in response? So that study came out last September. It's really excellent. I'll drop a link to the chat in the chat to that if folks want to take a look at it. And since that study came out, the workforce system in Hawaii has then said, okay, how do we take what we learned here about folks' digital literacy skills and build on that? So they're now working with a group of employers to administer the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment, which is a foundational digital skills assessment, to incumbent workers to get a better sense of what incumbent workers' skills look like and to be able to help the workforce system understand what are the baseline skills people need to have to get jobs, what are the skills they need to have to keep jobs and to get promoted. So that's another really great example from Hawaii. San Antonio and Long Beach are two other cities that have done really creative work on workforce, on digital inclusion activities and digital skills. They haven't been quite as formal in engaging their workforce board per se, but they've involved community-based organizations that are workforce providers and adult education providers. So I would certainly look at San Antonio and look at Long Beach, California. And then the last is one that I mentioned earlier today in my previous presentation. The Workforce Professionals Training Institute in New York is leading a 9-month digital transformation initiative, which is for workforce center staff, not for clients, not for job seekers or adult learners, but for workforce center staff to be thinking about their digital skills and their digital transformation. And the folks at WPTI, Workforce Professionals Training Institute, are just terrific and really responsive if you want to pick up the phone and talk with them. Long answer to your question, but yeah, there are some interesting examples bubbling up nationally. Other questions live in the room?
Yes, we do have one.
Concerns I see is that, you just covered the workforce folks who are learning the digital, getting the digital skills themselves, not the general public. That's important. However, with what we're doing already, how, sometimes it's a time crunch to even learn those new skills. So you might pick up one thing here, one thing there, and learn it organically rather than being fully immersed in it.
Yes. Okay. So, what's your name, Kitty? Kitty asked, she said that there are multiple concerns that you've addressed in this presentation, and those are important from what you've covered. But sometimes it's a time crunch, and to learn those new skills can be difficult. And you might pick up something here or there, right? But I think maybe the question is how do you manage your time to gain all those skills better when we're already so pressed for time?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And that actually gets at, I think, a bigger issue than any digital skills in particular, right? It gets to a question of power, and it gets to a question of labor organizing, right? Because in general, we want people to have the opportunity to grow and learn throughout their careers. But we also don't want them to feel like they have to pay for and do all their training on their own by themselves without their companies investing in them, without our society as a whole investing in them. So my organization is doing a lot of advocacy right now to try to help policymakers see but it's not fair to expect people to pick up these skills in their spare time when they're already trying to raise kids and hold down a job and deal with caregiving and all the other things. So we want to make sure that, for example, Pell Grant funding can be used, that people are building digital skills as part of training to be an EMT or training to be a machine operator or programmable logic technician, whatever the position might be. We want to make sure people have earn and learn opportunities like apprenticeship, but not only apprenticeship, right? So you can get paid while you're in the learning process. I don't think it's fair and I don't think it's appropriate for people to be expected to do all of this on their own time, on their own dime, right? This is a role for public policy and public organizations and the workforce system and employers to be investing jointly in people's skills and their future. And this is why your voices are so important in the digital equity planning process, right? If you don't speak up, I promise you, the big telecoms and the vendors, they will all be in there happy to sell their products and focus the attention on their particular things. We need to make sure that worker voices and the needs of workers and the needs of their families are centered in this process. And that is not something that any one organization or any one person is responsible for. That's something we're all responsible for.
I think we don't have any other ones live.
Okay, so there's a couple more in the chat, which I'm going to lift up. There was one about whether the grants would be a single 5-year grant or whether they would be shorter 1-year or multi-year grants. We don't know the answer to that yet. We don't know whether the feds are going to put out 1 5-year grant or shorter ones. My guess is they won't do 5 different 1-year application processes because that's crazy making on their end and they don't have enough staff to manage that. But other than that, I mean, that's just a guess on my part. There's another question in the chat from Thomas asking about who will do the digital upskilling and what is the training curriculum? Who decides what training is needed and how to do it? Short answer is that is all up in the air right now, right? The law does not say it must be this type of organization, it must be this type of training. It says states need to reach these groups of people. States can use these types of organizations to reach these groups of people. These organizations can provide this long list of potential services. So there's a lot of freedom that states have to be able to tackle this in the way that they see fit. But I would caution you again, digital skills are an area where the landscape is changing so quickly that no one measurement test or no one curriculum is ever going to cover everything people need to learn. So think instead about how to help people build digital resilience so that when they're learning these foundational skills and these industry-specific skills, they can keep adapting over time. So that's my answer to that question. I see one more question in the chat here, which is individuals in the demographic that I serve live and dwell in the great digital divide. What can I do to help bridge this gap when the organization I serve and my funding is lacking innovative and properly functioning technology, right? That is a common problem. There are lots of people across the country right now who are like, well, I know my job seekers need tech help. I know they need resources, but even my organization doesn't have the tech that we need to be able to serve them appropriately. So again, I'll go back to, there's a lot of federal COVID relief money still available in communities. This is a great time to be talking to your local economic development office, talk to your public libraries. The Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services is putting out lots of big grants related to digital skills and digital literacy, digital devices, digital broadband access. If any of you are in communities with a tribal college or university or a tribal nation, there's some funding that's going out specifically for tribal institutions. So you know, being as creative as possible about non-WIOA funds is important. And again, you don't have endless time in the day. I'm not suggesting you go research every kind of federal dollar everywhere. Think about where you have a good relationship with a state official, a local official, and ask them what's available that they're aware of, and see if that is something that could help your organization be able to build its own capacity. Because we can't help job seekers and workers if we're not able to build our own organization's capacities. Okay, I think that may be it from the questions in the chat. I'm just double checking to make sure. I think that's it. Anything else in the room, or should we go ahead and I'll show the last couple of slides, the resources slides, and then we'll close out.
Nope, I think we're good, Amanda.
Okay, so the next slide has my contact information. You'll see that in a minute. Feel free, I'm very accessible via email, text, or phone if you want to be in touch. I'm in the Eastern time zone, but I do work usually up until 5 o'clock Central. Next slide. We did just put out a brand new fact sheet, sort of Digital Equity Act 101. If you don't want to share this whole long slide presentation with people, but you do want to give them kind of a quick overview of the money and where it's coming from, you can please share this fact sheet. Next slide. We also have a longer report that we did on industry-specific digital skills. That's on our website. And the link to that is on the slide here. And then on this question of other resources, there's a slide, one last slide here with a list of different blog posts and other publications. So the very last slide just sort of links to a whole bunch of different materials that we've put out over the past couple of years. I mentioned also the Hawaii report that is on the National Skills Coalition website. If you click on our skills blog, you'll see a blog post with state innovations on digital equity. Hawaii is one of those states, and you can just click through and read the report. Thank you all so much for hanging tough through a long and very detailed presentation at the end of a long and very full day, and even for hanging in when I had tech difficulties. I also want to give a really big shout out to Heather, who has been invaluable behind the scenes for both of my sessions today, for Kirsten, and for the whole team, Dr. Julian, Kathy Tracy, and others who have put together today's event and who have made it possible for all of us to be here and be learning from each other. Thank you so much. Please don't hesitate to be in touch, and I hope to see you in person next year. Take care.